Tonight then, with the amount of corruption, looting and maladministration plaguing South Africa's state-owned entities, what is their strategic value, and is it time to consider selling them? The Presidential Review Committee on SOEs recommended that a SOE Council of Ministers be put in place to look particularly at the administration of policies and to actually come up with a new framework that governs these SOEs and to regulate and look after it. Listen to what the President had to say on that council.
Now, to support our reform process, the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council has outlined a clear set of reforms that will enable these vital public companies to fulfill their mandate for growth and development. Overarching legislation for state-owned enterprises will be tabled in Cabinet this financial year and Parliament in the next financial year. A centralized SOE model is being implemented this financial year, which will ensure a standardized governance, financial management and operational performance framework for all our SOEs. The mandates of all SOEs are being re-evaluated to ensure that they are responsive to the country's needs and the implementation of the National Development Plan.
All recommendations coming from the PRC. The question is the picture beginning to change? And is there a sense of urgency in addressing these matters? Here to unpack this further, I'm joined by the former chairperson of the Presidential SOE Review Committee, Ria Piega, Business Unity South Africa President, Bonang Mohale, former Business Unity, or rather current Business Unity South Africa President, I beg your pardon, and NUMSA spokesperson, Pagamile Hlubi Majolo. You're the part of this conversation tonight. What's your take on the strategic value of SOEs if they are being looted? 072-110-5584. Otherwise, tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Maria, let's begin with you. Is the picture beginning to improve? Your recommendations were presented to Parliament in 2012. I think 2013 they were adopted by Parliament. Parliament said these are good. What they do need, though, is a champion to drive them successfully. Now, about 10 years later, is the picture beginning to change, and are you getting a sense that there is a degree of commitment and urgency in reforming our SOEs?
Sabo, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this dialogue. The question you're asking as to whether the situation is starting to change, absolutely not. I'm glad to hear what the clip you've just played by the President, because that's something that has been redacted from the report that we put together. I am of the view that there is nothing that is changing, because clearly there's no readiness to change. And if readiness to change is missing, we get in nowhere. There's no willingness to change. And I would start arguing that I question whether we have the ability to change. All those things that I've mentioned are missing. You know, we talk, but we do not act. And I want to also argue that it's not for lack of advice, inputs. There have been many reports, even before our report of the SOE report. So I just think the ability to act is one big missing element in this whole picture.
With that lacking ability to act, is there rationale in government taking ownership of these SOEs?
Look, the importance of SOEs, not just in the South African economy, but globally, is there. I mean, examples of successful use of SOEs is out there for everybody. Go to Singapore, look at Temasek, go to Malaysia, and even see that they have global leading SOEs such as Petronas going out there, you know, to do things. So examples are galore everywhere. The economy of this country, you know, if you take an SOE such as ISCO, was established those years purely because we were a resource-based economy. And right now, for instance, that SOE is no longer there. and we continue to have a mining industry without a proper steel industry to support the fundamental core economic driver of this country. So there are a lot of questions that we have to ask ourselves. I mean, you just have to look to PRASA and ask yourself to say, come on, the roads are filled with trucks and everything. What are we doing? How could we even get to the point where we are? Now we are going to have to go and look for fresh resources now to rebuild PRASA. We had invested in that. We can't keep starting. There must be a starting, progress, and a conclusion or continuation. We seem to be a country that is focusing on starting and starting and starting and starting. I'm very concerned.
Dr. Mohale, before we get into the meat of the various terms of reference, developmental, transformation, ownership, governance, viability of funding, and so on and so forth, give us your first thinking around the rationale of, or even say the strategic value of our SOEs in light of the looting that continues even today.
Mangqale ngokubingelela usisi intombi kaMajola lemme Mogadi ke a le dumedisa.
Thank you.
What is lacking is political will. What is lacking is implementation. We have all the plans in the world. We've got all the skills in the world. We've got all the strategic intent. We've got all the resources in the world. I'm on record as saying South Africa, and indeed Africa, it's not a poor continent, just poorly managed. I don't understand why we don't even start with the opportunity cost. Had we put African women in the 28 years of democracy in the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies, and we allowed them only to serve a period of 5 years, no more, without any political interference. Even with 20% of them failing, today we'll be looking at 3,000 strong women with a demonstrable track record who know how to run a 92-year-old South African Airways. So that when Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airways is looking for a CEO, they are not looking at Europe, but looking south to this award-winning African airline. You know, the Zondo Commission has been absolutely scathing. And I think at the heart of this is two things. One, state capture. Number two, this notion of cadre deployment. If we're to do away with only those two, there is no reason why the 60.1 million South Africans, any one of us, should go to bed hungry. Let me conclude, Babu Mhluli, by saying, unfortunately, where government fails, the people that suffer the most are the poorest of the poor and labor, because the middle class can afford private medical aid, private education, private security. It's us, the poor people, that depend on the state to provide education for our children, healthcare when we are unwell, and during the 2 weeks of rampant looting, we expect them to protect us.
Pagamile, welcome and thank you very much for your time. Please unmute for us so we can hear you. Why have our SOEs faced such challenges in pursuing the developmental and transformation goals that were set for this country?
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers, and of course, good evening to the panel, Dr. Mohale and Mayor Pierre. Thank you for having me on your show. For us as a trade union, it is unequivocal, and it is absolutely something that we stand by, the fact that we do need state-owned entities. They do play a crucial role in our economy. If you look at SAA, for example, SAA alone as an entity contributed 40,000 jobs in total along the value chain. This was before the business rescue process, before COVID, and before its collapse. And Eskom is an entity whose role is the general electrification of this country. And we still need an ESCOM to do that, because no private sector player is going to ensure that the indigent and the poor have access to electricity at an affordable rate. So yes, indeed, as Mayor Pierre correctly pointed out, you had a state-owned entity like ISCO, which was established by the apartheid government back then to benefit the white working class. You then have a government which comes into power, the ANC. And of course, I'm not at all celebrating apartheid. It's a system that deserved to die. But the fact that these entities were set up with a developmental agenda is something that this government had a responsibility to ensure continued. Now, all of these entities are collapsing. We can blame many people, but the reality is that the blame and the buck stops with government, who is the shareholder in all of these entities. And they have collapsed precisely because of this government and its inability to manage these entities. Does that mean we should not have state-owned entities? Absolutely not. What we should be doing as a society is holding this government to account. They failed us, and if they failed, then we need to do something about that. But to destroy these entities, which have such an important role in growing this economy, in growing jobs, would be an absolute disaster.
Why have existing institutional oversight structures failed to manage and counter corruption and mismanagement in our SOEs? That question next when we continue here on In Focus. What are your thoughts tonight? Session on SOEs tonight here on In Focus. Why have the institutional systems put in place for oversight failed to manage and counter the acts of corruption that are seemingly evidently entrenched, regardless of what administration is in place? Ria Pierre Bonang Mohale, as well as Paramile Hlubi Majola, with us tonight, and taking your views on that as well in a moment. Maria, part of what you recommended was a change of management that was required to effect the developmental state concept, including a vision must be in place, enabling framework must be in place, performance monitoring and evaluation, competence and capacity, all these things must be in place. What we have seen with this new administration is some move, a change to reform boards and management and so on and so forth. But the same challenges are continuing. Why have the existing systems of institutional oversight failed to manage this issue of corruption and curb mismanagement?
I think, firstly, I would say we're dealing here also with something that is normally called nomenclature called malicious compliance. Clearly, what is on paper, what is recommended, and what is happening are two different issues. If we look at what is happening, just look at how boards are appointed and how boards are undermined, because the shareholder doesn't actually sit in his lane and appoint competent, independent, strong, bold boards. Those people are appointed, and the next thing there is interference of a minister. The next thing you hear the CEO of post offices, of somebody else we were seeing, doing something to take post office somewhere, an entity we need for our rural development and for rural people to have access to certain amenities and facilities. You go to other countries and see how they are using their post office in areas where they have vast rural areas. You start wondering, why are we squandering opportunities such as that? So for me, really, I'm starting to say the shareholder must start being very focused in terms of respecting the fact that they can appoint competent, capable boards, which can be held accountable by the shareholder minister, who is a representative of government in terms of these SOEs, who would equally account to the council of ministers that is going to be responsible for these entities. That board that is appointed must be held accountable to hold the CEOs and the executives and the entity responsible and make sure that there is proper performance and give the oversight. For as long as politics interferes with these processes of governance, we are getting nowhere, because every time a new minister comes in, the CEO is chopped off. Every time a new minister comes in, the priorities change. We need to clean that space.
What are you seeing happening? What is our current approach?
For harmony between politics and the existence of this SOEs.
Sorry, let me come in here.
Right now,
what are you seeing
as
our current approach to SOE board leadership versus CEO, responsibility of boards versus the responsibility of state? What is the current state of play?
Sorry, Tabo, I missed something.
I'm saying, what is the current state of play? What is our approach currently that you are seeing
chaos,
when it comes to SOE boards, their leadership versus the leadership of...
There is no, even in madness, they say there's a method. I would argue that we are currently operating in a space where I would say there is no methodology. There is adhocracy through and through. Somewhere looks like it's working, somewhere it's complete chaos.
Yeah. And that's precisely it, Dr. Bonang. Somewhere it looks like it's working. There are some SOEs that are reporting good results, and some it looks like it's not working. What is at fault here in terms of the functioning of SOE boards? Our approach to the leadership of SOEs versus the leadership of CEOs, the responsibility of boards versus the responsibility of state.
Let's not mince our words. It has become very clear that this ANC-led government actually likes this chaos, this mess, this lack of governance, because it suits them. Because if there was order, it's like light. It would be sanitized, and therefore you can't steal, you can't cheat, you can't bribe. So it suits them to continue to steal. Remember, in the first 5 years of state capture, we stole 1.5 trillion South African rands. In the 9 wasted years, we siphon off on average 200 billion a year every year. That goes only to the 2 Zupta families. Imagine how many people at Trins would have eradicated, how much of service would have given to the poor and the indigent, to what an extent would have improved the quality of lives of the people of Alexander, how would have made a better life for all. But for me, as I conclude, Babu Mdluli, the words used by Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo in his report number 1 of 3 that came in 3 volumes, it's actually quite instructive when he speaks about this, a sitting president, that he was dishonest and fled from accountability, that he was calculating in betraying his people, that he helped Guptas to capture the state, that he was the center, front and center in colluding with the private sector to intentionally capture SARS, that this ANC benefited from the proceeds of corruption, that it abused the government tender system, that it did not care or slept on the job or had no clue what to do, and its government did nothing to stop the decline of state institutions. So you see, Babu Mdluli, if you understand how state capture works, it rests on 4 legs. The first, of course, is to create a shadow state. Number 2 is to repurpose the state-owned enterprises. But the third is to get rid of good people and replace them with people whose only claim is to aid and abet state capture. Lastly, you're not happy that you've been drinking from the tap. Now you want to drink from the fire hose. You want to capture national treasury because it owns 2 entities, South African Revenue Service, and it owns the biggest asset manager in the continent, called the PIC, that in 2010 had 2 trillion assets under management. Babu Mdluli, Nkosia.
What do we say then? How do we fix this, right? Composition and nomination processes within state-owned entities. You said we must get rid of that thing called cadre deployment. And they argue, I mean, that cadre deployment doesn't begin with the ANC. Cadre deployment has been in place even in the days of the National Party. That's how they ensured that those who are appointed into these places carry out the mandate of the developmental and transformational state that was then at the time. At least those guys were very clear about what they wanted to do and who they wanted to benefit from these SOEs. Can we say the same about this cohort, this type of leadership that we have in place? And how do we fix this question of the composition and the nomination process?
So for me, I'm on record as saying if the ANC was giving us their best cadres, we'd leave them alone. But unfortunately, they are giving us absolutely the worst. One example is that weekend special of Des van Rooyen, kicking out a capable individual with a demonstrable track record, and over that weekend, we lost $30 billion. By Monday, when the stock exchange opened in the East, we were poised to lose 530 billion. That's why, as business, we marched in suits to the union building to say, not in our name. Lastly, Babumzu, I think let's really not confuse ourselves. There are more than enough measures, systems, and processes in place. The Public Finance Management Act that says our fiduciary responsibility is to act in the best interest of the entity, and not in the best interest of the shareholder, not the best interest of the employees. So what's needed here, Memo Khadi puts it nicely, it's role clarity and definition. Shareholder appoints a board that you trust and step out of the way. The board appoints a CEO that is up to the task and step out of the way. The CEO puts your own team in place so that if you're not performing, you are held finally accountable. You can't say, but the CFO you gave me was useless. But you see, when you are inherently conflicted and you want the 5-10% of the remuneration total cost to company of these cadre employees because you can't pay your own employees at least to the house, then it's not surprising that you want 20% of Hitachi boilers at Midupi, Kusile, and Ingula because you are actually desperate for money. So you are in power not to look after what's in the best interest of the poor and the most vulnerable. You are in it for the money.
We come back in a moment and we give Paramile Hlubimacho an opportunity to weigh in on this one. What is it that we need to do in the positioning or the composition and nomination processes at our boards? And she's seen a number of boards changing hands, and each and every one that comes in with their own turnaround strategy and getting us back to where we were and nothing ever getting done as we interrogate issues around the rationale of SOEs in a country that is gripped with corruption. This on the eve of part 2 of the report coming from the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, where we expect to hear more of the rot that went on, particularly at our SOEs. Pagamila, you've seen a turnaround of boards like I suppose many of us in various of these SOEs, from SAA, ESCOM, PRASA, and so forth, with various reasons. Either the CEO did not have security clearance all of a sudden, or there is a CEO that's asking for too much money. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things and stories that come up, and you just see a turnaround consistently, either at board level or at the executive level. What's failing in our composition and nomination processes at a board level?
Well, I think, first of all, our biggest problem is that the appointment of board members is not transparent at all. The minister simply wakes up and makes a decision about who should constitute board members, number one. Number two, these board members are not accountable to the public. And the one thing that NUMSA has said consistently from day one is that board members of SOEs need to be represented by, apart from those that are appointed by the minister, but you should have representation from trade unions, you should have representation from NGOs and civil society, so that ordinary South Africans can get real accountability and real transparency about decisions that are made, first and foremost. Secondly, I think we are all going to be very disappointed if we continue to make our analysis on the basis of which faction of the ANC is in charge. Under the so-called 9 wasted years, yes, there was definitely looting and corruption, but that looting and corruption even continues now, even today. And it continues under this new faction of the ANC. So I think we need to be very honest about what our real problem is in this country. Is it the various factions where some are liked by the media more than others? Or is it that we actually have a governance problem with the governing party that is in charge of these state-owned companies? And this is the conversation that we should actually be having with, as South Africans, because it's a question of accountability. When you look at SAA, for example, as we speak, we still don't have the financials for since March 2017. And SCOPA, as far as we're concerned, has failed in its duties to hold the minister, Pravin Gordhan, responsible in this respect. As far as we're concerned, there's a lot of mismanagement and looting that has continued to happen, even during the business rescue process. But because we don't have access to the financials, we won't really know the truth about how much of a role multinationals, for example, played in the looting of some of our SOEs. Swissport was a company which was named in the Zondo Commission. Swissport is still bidding for business from AXA. And yet it was instrumental in the corruption allegations that have come up in the first part of the report. So why is it that Swissport has not experienced some kind of consequence for its role? Why has there been no further investigation into Swissport in its role? Why, for example, has AXA not revoked Swissport's license, which it has the power to do? These are all very important questions, and these are ultimately part of the problem. Thirdly, Thabo, is that when you look at, and you spoke about the issue of the funding for SOEs and particularly the bank guaranteed loans that were rolled out, one of the things that we raised consistently as NUMSA, particularly during the business rescue process, was, for example, why were the bank loans and the terms and conditions of the loans also not the subject of review? When we're reviewing everything else, like at Eskom, for example, we've demanded a review of the cost of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, particularly for bid 1 to 4. We've demanded a review of what Eskom is paying in terms of coal costs. We've said that it is extremely exorbitant and it's causing it to collapse. And in fact, at some point, government did make a commitment that they would review the cost of REIPPs and coal, and they just absolutely never acted on that directive which had been given to them. Why are we not also looking at the role of the banks? Because the banks, no matter what happens to these SOEs, the banks get their money. And we need to ask ourselves whether the interest rates that have been charged are fair, whether what we're paying is correct and right, in light of the looting which we now know has taken place. And the people who are the ones who've actually paid the highest price for all of this has been ordinary workers. We've experienced a job loss bloodbath in all our SOEs, and there will be more jobs to be lost. Those are the people who are paying the consequences through job losses. The ministers who are responsible for these SOEs have not had to take any responsibility or accountability. The boards certainly don't have to take any accountability or responsibility. And these are things that need urgent intervention.
Are you saying the reason why there is no urgent intervention is that there's a disconnect between the policy direction or policy objectives that the ministers are pushing and the public service obligations that the SOEs think they need to be fulfilling?
It's much more than that. It's the fact that this government utilizes these state-owned entities in order to advance its own agendas that have absolutely nothing to do with what is in the public's interest. It is not in the public's interest to break Eskom up into 3 parts and sell it off to the private sector. once you allow the private sector to get involved in the provision of energy, it is ordinary workers and their families who will suffer. Right now, Eskom was at NERSA. Eskom said to NERSA that part of the reason it is demanding so much money is because of the cost of the renewable energy independent power producers. As NUMSA, we raised the issue of the cost of REIPPs in 2018 when the then Minister of Energy, Jeff Hadebe, was in charge. We were attacked by the media. We were attacked by the minister for trying to block him in court. And yet when we went to court, one of the things we found out was that this project was going to cost even more than the nuclear deal, which people said was corrupt under Jacob Zuma. Why is it acceptable that we can pay over R1 trillion for renewable energy, but it's not acceptable to pay R1 trillion for nuclear? Especially when, as a form of energy, some have argued nuclear is more reliable and more accessible and cheaper in the long run. So I think it is really time that we started critically analyzing the true intentions of some of these ministers and whether indeed they are acting in the interests of the public. It is definitely not in the public interest for these state-owned entities to be taken over by the private sector, because in the long term, what it means is that we're going to pay more, like we are paying more for electricity because of the involvement of the private sector. And it does not guarantee that the masses, the poor in particular, will be able to access those services because the private sector has no interest in guaranteeing services to the poor. They're only interested in profiteering.
Maybe let's bring in Mary here. One of the issues that you raised, Ma, was the lack of cooperation between SOEs and government department. Is there a link between policy objectives and SOE strategic objectives at the moment, the way that you're looking at it, right? For example, in a conversation with Eskom saying, well, we don't hold the policy on our IRPs. For example, it's determined by government. They're saying, for example, now renewable energies are cheaper in this bid window. And to Pamela's point, to take your point, the earlier bid windows were expensive. Even those independent producers are admitting that those were expensive. But Eskom saying we would like to buy electricity cheaper, but we don't hold the policy. The policy is sitting with government, so they determine where we go. Is there a linkage? Is there a relationship? Are these two things talking to each other?
I would argue that maybe before I do that, let me just say, you know, one thing listening to Bonang and Hlubi, the government that we have has an aversion to competence. They have a competence allergy. They have an integrity allergy. They have allergy to people who are bold and speak out. And I want to argue that South Africa is not short of competent people. Is not short of people with integrity. Is not short of people with boldness. So as nominations are done, people with those qualities are actually sidelined. People who can assist this country are at the periphery of the issues. So I would say upfront that those issues should be looked into and brought right to the center and use the skills that are there in this country well. Then we would start realizing our dream as a nation. On the issues that you've asked, I do believe that we have a lot of policy on paper, but that those policies are at odds with what we are doing. We are not a policy-centric country. We write policy, but we don't act policy. I would argue that there is very poor link and poor coordination of what is policy that is existing. We are more on, it depends who comes into, Hlubi has just mentioned the issue of nuclear and the type of processes that we're seeing right now. Just in 5 years, there's just a huge shift from where we were talking nuclear to another space now. That is there's no policy consistency. And as I have said earlier on, we are on a perpetual start mode. It depends who is in. And I do want to say our government is failing us.
We'll take a break and we'll continue in a moment. What suggestions are there in place? I mean, one of the issues that were raised by the Presidential Review Committee on SOEs was a State-Owned Entity Act, new legislation to be put in place. The President also referring to it in that speech. How will that assist us to turn things around at our SOEs? When we continue next, stay with us. Welcome back live tonight on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405, the spotlight falling on our SOEs. If we were to do at least 3 of the things recommended by the PRC report: 1, State-Owned Entity Act being put in place; 2, rationalization of SOEs and the centralized ownership model, what would that bring for our SOEs, and how far would that take us? That's the question we're putting to our panel tonight. Let's hear your views as well. 072-110-5584. Tweet us at Newzroom405. Maria, that's what you recommended. One of the things was, of course, the SOE Council of Ministers. It's been established in it and of itself. Of course, it doesn't mean much if it's not going to meet and actually do the work. But if we were to pick just 3 out of those things, right, come up with a State-Owned Entity Act, rationalization of SOEs, and adopting the centralized ownership model, what would that bring for our SOEs?
I think we would get to very far. Firstly, we must create an enabling environment, as you are saying. All those issues that you are mentioning were meant to create that enabling environment, to start saying, you know, you can't have SOEs lying all over the departments and not having one overarching sort of policy, strategy, legislation that actually says, yes, we are going to have SOEs because they are crucial for the economic development of this country, because they are crucial for the developmental state that we are gunning for. But create a framework that is going to enable them to be able to do so. Again, that what we are starting to see, it's short-termism. There is no long-planned strategy that all of us can glean and view and understand that this is the progress we are making in terms of this enabling strategy, in terms of this enabling environment, and this is the framework that we are looking for. We are looking at 5-year term that can be 3 years because the minister is now the minister is not there for 3 years, for 5 years, and all that. So that's one thing that we need to be looking into, an enabling environment. So that legislation would bring standardization, would make sure that there is a framework within which these entities are being established, operating on, and can be viewed. You know, the performance will be based on that particular framework. I also want to say capacity of the state-owned SOEs. All of us have been mentioning that the boards that are there, the executives that are there, the shareholder that is focusing on that the capacity must be there. A lot of these SOEs have not been capitalized properly on takeover in 1994. Some of them have been limping from there on. You know, we will keep on putting in money, but this capitalization should have been looked at, and we understand how we are doing it, to what extent, when can we start saying it, we have done sufficient. I mean, you just have to take, for an example, Transnet is battling with the pension fund. Just never capitalized. It's moving from point to point to point. It's an ailing aspect of that. So I think there's much more that needs to be done. The strategy, the enabling environment, the performance of SOEs, the capacity of those entities, and ensuring that, there is independence, there is oversight, there is capacity of those boards and the executives to be able to do their work.
Yeah. Dr. Mohale, you said there's enough money to fund this thing, the viability and the funding of these businesses. Are all SOEs deserving of a bailout?
So what we definitely need is more simplicity, not more complexity. We have more than enough laws to deal with the current challenges. Whilst we support the PRC's recommendation, we make an example that had we used just the existing laws on corruption, not even state capture, the top state capture miscreants would be in jail as we speak. For instance, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FEAC Act, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, the Protected Disclosures Act, and even a simple Criminal Procedures Act. What is needed is implementation. So I think what these SOEs need more than anything else is to restore their own reputation, integrity, and credibility, and thereby regain the social license to operate. Because at the moment, they've been used as a crucible for looting by this government. So that all of us as social partners, we participate in the restoration of these institutions, even institutions of a criminal justice system, including the police and prosecution services. Imagine if all of us just support the independent public procurement with its anti-corruption agency, including a council, an inspectorate, a litigation unit with its own tribunal and the Court of Appeal that Raymond Zondo is recommending that it be established. Let me close by saying, Babu Mzulu, we don't even have to reinvent the wheel and sound clever. Singapore is amongst the top 5 countries in the world in terms of per capita income. We even forgotten that they were thrown out by Malaysia. They run only 3 things. They are saying drive meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. China, for the last 70 years, have been driving 2 things and 2 things only, which is personal security and energy security. In Singapore, when you bring a new act, the constitution says you must also come with a recommendation of which act must be taken out. Because at the moment, you look at our constitution, it's already too heavy. Even the politicians don't understand the Section 95 of the executive duties. That's why they come into the jobs. They don't even know what is expected of them as their own job description.
Let's take some calls. 072-110-5584. We've got Tyson in Centurion on the line. Tyson, good evening, and thank you very much for calling in. What is your comment, or what is your question tonight?
Good evening, Tabo, and good evening to the panel. Look, I have a comment, not really a question, but I have a comment. The issue with regard to the state-owned entities, for me, as an ordinary citizen of this country, I'm really worried. And also, I think the other thing is that what is happening now is actually a system that has been developed over the years, and that it can only be a system that was developed by the governing party, I feel like. And until that system has been rooted out, we can appoint as many people as we want to manage the state-owned entities, but it will not help at all. I feel like what needs to be done is to root out the system that has been laid out. It's a layer that has been laid across all.
Give me an example, Tyson. What is the system that you think is a layer?
Okay, the layer that I'm talking about is a corruption layer that has been laid out. So all these policies that we have in the country, there are good policies that are on paper, like what Mepieka said. They are good policies that we have, but they don't get to be implemented because there is something that is actually preventing those people who get appointed. Some of them are good people who can implement those policies, but they can't implement them because there is something that is stopping them from implementing those. So obviously, with that, until the system that has been implemented or that has been laid out by the governing party is rooted out of these state-owned entities, will not go anywhere. We can appoint as many people as we want, but we're not going to get anywhere. And the other thing that I also want to highlight is the act that has been proposed, which I still feel like we're going to have it if we do have it. But who is supposed to now go according to that act? It's the same people that are going to be appointed. And if they are getting appointed the way they are still being appointed by the same government, then that act will be useless, like any other act that we have in this country.
Tyson, I appreciate your call. Thank you very much for your comment tonight. Pamela, as we close, I'll give you the last couple of minutes there. Retention, merging and disposal is the conversation that we're having. Which ones do we keep? Which ones do we merge? Which ones do we get rid of? Are all SOEs deserving of a bailout?
We keep all of them because we can't afford to lose any of them. We can't afford to have any more jobs lost. I think we have reached a point in our country where one more job loss is one too many. And until we start to have that attitude from the highest level of government, we're not going to see any real changes. And I think your caller makes a very good point. What is the problem here? Is the problem that there are not enough laws, as Ntate Mohale clearly pointed out? There clearly are. There clearly are systems in place. But what is the problem? And the problem, as far as we can see as NUMSA, is this governing party and a lack of political will to do the right thing as far as our state-owned entities are concerned. And I think we can just add on the issue of some of the suggestions that are being made in terms of taking SOEs forward. We need a situation, and this is something that NUMSA has been calling for at many times, that where SOEs need to work closer together in terms of their agenda. So, for example, we would have liked to see a SAA working more closely together with other entities in transportation in order to create that proper network that's actually going to service the public properly and fairly and in a more affordable way. We would have liked to see, for example, in aviation, policies that would have guaranteed that only SAA or South African-owned airlines are allowed to fly domestically. These are policies that other countries have implemented. They guarantee their own domestic airspace for the benefit of the domestic economy, for the benefit of the domestic industry, to guarantee growth in that industry. So we would like to see a government that is more intentional about using these SOEs for the benefit of the masses, in order to improve their lives. And until those kinds or that type of thinking takes place within the governing party, unfortunately, we're not going to see any real positive changes in the way SOEs are being run in South Africa.
Mary Pierre and Pamela Hlubi Majol, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. That's where we leave it.